Right, hello there. My name is Stephen Pett. I'm one of the advisors at RE Today, and I'm recording this webinar for you on RE learning in the brain. So as usual, I'm at home recording this, and there are young children around, so at any point there may be an interruption and I may have to pause. Also, when this is live, there's opportunities for discussion, and so I will be pausing occasionally for that while there are discussion points and activities for you to do. I'll set those up and I'll tell you what you need to do, and then you'll have a handout as well to help you do that. So the idea for the next 90 minutes or so is to explore some of the research around the brain and learning, giving a brief summary of some of the key ideas and making some links with RE. It's connected to the current RE focus on in Ofsted more broadly, not just on RE, on pupils remembering the stuff they've been taught. Of course, obviously, we've always wanted pupils to do that. There's a particular focus over the last few years. And that's connected to wider ideas of cognition, the sort of mental processes involved in knowing, understanding, and learning, and also metacognition, how we monitor or direct our learning as well. And we'll get to those points in due course. So I'm going to try and refer to a few of the most interesting and helpful books and research papers that I've come across, some older books and some of the newer research. Obviously, it's not going to be the definitive guide to neuroscience and learning, but it may point you in the direction of where you want to look to explore further. And you'll discover that not everyone agrees on this. And so there'll still be some thinking to do at the end of this. It's not going to give you all the answers about learning and the brain. So my interest in this was stimulated by my involvement in a project linking advanced skills teachers in Gloucestershire schools with the Institute for the Future of the Mind at the University of Oxford, actually over 15 years ago now. And so we were a mixed group of primary and secondary teachers from a variety of subjects. And we were interested in two key areas that have been really influential in current education practice. That's cognitive neuroscience, which is underpinned by brain imaging technologies, and cognitive psychology, which is underpinned by interpretive, behavioral, and observational methods. And so we would meet every half term and would have input from an expert in neuroscience. So we had stuff on neuroscience and dyslexia, gifted students, the adolescent brain, attention, emotions in the brain. And we had a chance to think about it and explore the implications of what we had heard, and then take it away to try it out, things out in our own practice in the classroom. Then we'd get back together again and discuss what we'd done, and then have the next bit of input. So one result of my involvement with the project was the demythologizing of certain trends that, at the time anyway, were generally seen as scientific. And so three of the sort of neuromyths that were prevalent for many years, but hopefully no longer, the idea of brain gym. This is no use at all behind brain gym. There's no science behind it, although a bit of exercise does do you good. The idea that left brain logical, right brain creative, well, yes, but it's nowhere near as simple as that implies. And some of you will remember VAK, visual auditory kinesthetic learning, which is completely debunked by the neuroscience, although variety in teaching and learning approaches does have value in maintaining people's interest and helping them to see things in different contexts. Now, the research suggested actually that where there is impact on pupils' learning outcomes, that can often be put down to teacher enthusiasm. It's their involvement in a project that makes them teach with a little bit more zip, and that is what makes a difference to pupils' achievement. And so that's something to bear in mind as you get tired towards the end of a term, for example. Now, of course, there's a real danger of creating more neuromyths by introducing a little bit of information to you, and so I'm going to try not to do that. There's one myth that walnuts are good for the brain, and when you ask and find out why people think that's the case, it's because they look a little bit like brains. The philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, things that can be put in a nutshell should be left there. And so I want to suggest that this session is a pointer for you to explore some of these ideas in more depth if you want to take this a bit further. This is not the end point. Now, I mentioned that the original project I was involved in was over 15 years ago now, and those neuromyths about the brain gym and VAK are long gone, I hope. But the newer trends in education around cognitive load and growth mindsets still face challenges. I'm not always sure actually who's right in the end. But we do need to be careful about jumping to expert conclusions on the basis of novice understanding, which is what I'm offering here. The Education Endowment Foundation warns against what it calls lethal mutations, where a practice becomes disconnected from the theory itself. So they give the example of dual coding. And many of you will know about that, the idea of connecting information to an image. And they say dual coding can sometimes mean that irrelevant illustrations are added to presentations, and that becomes a distraction rather than a help. So let's be careful about lethal mutations and neuromyths. Now, this session, we're going to look at 4 main areas. I'm going to give you some input and some implications, and then I'll give you an opportunity to pause if you're in a group for discussion and some activities as well. Now, I know that many of you will have encountered many of these terms, and the focus in education at the moment is on the strategies, what you actually do with these things. But what I want to do is give you a little bit on how the brain works so that you can see how these strategies fit, with the sort of context in which they work. And so that's what I'm going to start off with in this session. Now, there are lots of books on the brain and some about the brain and learning. In one of these books, John Geek's book on the brain at school is, I think, perhaps one of the most thorough. I mean, he's a neuroscientist. But Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? That's perhaps one of the most influential in terms of teaching and learning, and he's a cognitive psychologist. Now, the 2 research papers at the bottom there, we've got the Education Endowment Foundation studies, and one on the left is the full evidence, 300 pages or so. On the right, we've got a summary, and that is an analysis of the research around the brain and learning. Now, how effective is it? And so they take the findings from cognitive neuroscience and cognitive psychology. So some studies that are done experimentally perhaps in the lab, and then they explore how they're applied in the classroom. So we'll come back to their findings a little bit later, but their booklets are really excellent in terms of bibliographies and references to key research papers. So today we're actually going to start with the cognitive neuroscience. We're going to move on to the cognitive psychology. I want to start by giving you just a simple introduction to the brain and the idea of brain plasticity. And so you may well know some of this already, but I'm just going to give some of that background information for completeness, really. So while the brain is only 2.5% of our body by mass, it consumes 20% of our energy use at rest. So while our body is at rest, the brain is using up 20% of our energy. Newborn babies, their brain is about 400 grams, whereas an adult human brain is almost 4 times the size, 1.5 kilos. A dolphin has a similar sized brain to a human being, but a great white shark's brain is about 34 grams, although, of course, it has much bigger teeth. Now, the majority of the human brain is taken up with the cortex. That's the folded part you can see around the outside in that little model there. And so those parts which deal with the higher functions, such as thinking and memory and judgment and emotion. So if you have a rat, and if you could peel the cortex off and flange it out, only 20% of it is taken up with the cortex. The majority of space is devoted to more basic drives. So if you could flatten out the rat, you would see that the rat's cortex, you would see it covers no more than a postage stamp. If you could flatten out the cortex of a chimpanzee, it would cover the equivalent to an A4 piece of paper. But for a human cortex, it would cover the equivalent of an A2 sheet of paper. So it's heavily folded, more so in humans than other creatures. As I'm sure you know, brain cells are called neurons, and these neurons connect together to form vast networks, with each connection a possible pathway for information through the brain. So there's around 150,000 kilometers of neural networks. Now, we're born with most of our 100 billion brain cells or neurons. And given that we already have these neurons, then what is it that accounts for that 400% increase in weight of the brain from infant to adult? It's the growth in connections that increases that. So each cell may have around 10,000 connections. Hence, you can see the complexity of our brains. On top of that, there are 36 chemical neurotransmitters working in various combinations. And so you can see what I mean about not oversimplifying this staggeringly complex piece of kit. Now here on this slide, you can see how the connections get more and more dense over the first couple of years. And then they continue to do so. Obviously, they have to stop at some point or our heads will explode. And it's about the age of 4 that our brains begin to prune some of those connections, the ones that we don't need anymore, which allows the remaining ones to get better and faster connections, and more on that a little bit later. So everything that we do, that we see, that we touch, even that we think, has a physical impact on the structure of the brain. It changes the way it's wired up. It leaves a physical imprint on your brain, which is entirely personal. There's some pretty extreme research has been done measuring intracranial effects, so within the skull, where epilepsy patients in California had probes stuck into their brains. And researchers found what they call the Halle Berry effect. And so those researchers were looking to see how individual neurons fired, how they sent out an electrical impulse, releasing chemical neurotransmitters, and thus making connections with other neurons. And they found that in one patient, there was an individual neuron that only fired with a picture of Halle Berry. Even the word was enough, even a picture of Halle Berry in a Catwoman outfit. They tried pictures of other female celebrity actresses to get this neuron to fire, but it didn't work. Now, the paper in Nature argues you can't read too much into this, but one implication is that all the information that we receive through our senses is encoded in the brain. And the conclusions of the researchers are that we have what they call an invariant, sparse, and explicit code, which enables us to instantly link strikingly different pictures and symbols and even words with long-term and abstract memories, kind of like hotkeys. So you see the image, and then that is the neuron or small cluster of neurons that makes the connections with other parts of your memory. So the general message, though, is clear that our experiences change the physical structure of our brain. And repeated use of networks then strengthens the connections across the neurons and their synapses. And so people suggest neurons that fire together wire together. And some neuroscientists suggest you can compare this to a pathway through the woods. At first, the pathway is weak and difficult to make, but with repeated use, the pathway becomes easier and faster. So I'm sure you recognize that process in your own learning as well. I mean, let's connect that neuroscience with a bit of cognitive psychology. Now, some of you may know about this idea that when we start learning something, we're at the stage of unconscious incompetence. We don't know that we don't know. Let me illustrate, using how to drive a car. We sit there to learn how to drive, and we don't realize we don't know how to do it because our parents can drive, and so it can't be that difficult. And then we start having a lesson and we become consciously incompetent. We become aware that we don't know how to do it. And then we do a load of practice and more and more practice, and we become consciously competent. So we drive, we have to look, think about what we're doing with our feet and with our hands and looking in the mirrors. We have to think about braking, what we're going to do when we come out to a roundabout. We just have to think about it hard. And then with a load more practice, we get to the stage that you may have driven into school this morning and you don't even remember the journey. In one sense, it's become so automatic, the process gets so automatic that it's embedded, and those networks are so fast that you don't have to actually expend much energy, you don't have to pay much attention to it. So I recall when I first started teaching at A-level, I was at the conscious incompetence level. So I knew that I didn't know what I was teaching because I'd never taught the subject before. And so it was helpful, although it was stressful at the time. As a few years later, when I was verging on what I might call unconsciously competent in some aspects of the syllabus, I'd forgotten what it was like for students themselves. And so for those of us, and it will out for you in primary schools as well, you're looking at all these pupils and you are aware of, you know the stuff, and you're constantly having to remember what it's like not to know. I know that's what you do very well, and that's the idea that you're helping them to move from that unconscious incompetence through to unconscious competence, through practicing, through repetition. So it's really important to think about when we're structuring learning, to recognize what it is like when we don't have enough knowledge to be able to make the connections for yourself, which is why we need to do things again and again and again. So we make new connections. Now, the opposite is also true, actually. If we don't use the connections, then the pathways become weaker. The suggestion is that you use it or you lose it. If the connection doesn't fire across the synapse, it begins to lose that connection. And then it can get pruned in order to create a sturdier system for the other aspect, the other parts, other networks that are getting stronger. Now, the upshot of all this is that the brain is plastic. The term neuroscientists use. It's malleable, it grows and it changes. It's not just in infants and adolescents either. There was a time when people thought that the connections were all made before the age of 7, so that you had to hothouse children up to that point. But we now know that there are sometimes a particular sensitivity, such as infancy and adolescence, but the growth in connections can continue into old age. And there's a famous study done on the brains of London taxi drivers, and researchers measured the increase in volume of the hippocampus area of the brain as taxi drivers learned the knowledge. So hippocampus is to do with visual spatial memory, and they saw the density, actually the size of the hippocampus increased dramatically. And the increase in size was proportionate to the amount of time the person had been driving a cab, suggesting that its size depends on how much a person has used their spatial memory. So London taxi drivers have to memorize the map of London, that's the knowledge. Now, the point is that these changes happen in adults as well. And another study showed how the increase of grey matter in the brain after subjects were given training in juggling. So there's 1 month's training and practice between scans 1 and 2, and then 3 months with no juggling until scan 3. So there's a reduction in the density of grey matter, but not to 0. And so the skills we learn and then forget can still leave a bit of an imprint. So that's the idea of brain plasticity. Now, you've almost certainly come across Carol Dweck's work on growth mindsets. And the Stanford psychologists found that teaching students that their brains are plastic, that they can change depending on the input, help to shift their thinking towards growth mindset. So their summary suggests that some pupils have a fixed mindset. They think they've got a fixed amount of intelligence. They find mistakes demoralizing. Whereas with a growth mindset, pupils realize that mistakes are part of the learning process. They're part of making better and stronger connections. And they recognize that our brains are like a muscle, that they get better with practice. And that can also help pupils to develop more of a growth mindset. Now, that's really influential, and it's in many places in education. But it's widespread, but it's still slightly controversial. I mean, the Advanced Skills Teacher Group, the ST group that I was part of in Gloucestershire, tried to reproduce her findings, but they were unable to do so. So they replicated the study, Dweck's study, and their conclusions suggest this. There's a mild but significant increase in belief in incremental intelligence, that's the growth mindset, but no effect on pupil outcomes during the duration of the study. Now, of course, you always say you need more time, you need to do more study, but it's just mild but significant, and then no effect on pupil outcomes. You know, it's not. Well, I suppose we just need to be wary about overblowing conclusions about this, and then look a bit further. So there we go. That sets up a context really for Ofsted's current definition of learning. So learning can be defined as an alteration in long-term memory. If nothing is altered in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. So that sounds pretty radical, doesn't it? Very harsh. This idea that alteration in long-term memory, while in one sense every experience changes our brains, there'll be some neural connections coming. The emphasis is on strong connections. Those connections that last, the ones that are done through repetition and practice, where the connections are quicker. Now, the Education Endowment Foundation booklet offers this sort of model. There's a process of going from a sensory input, we see something or we hear something, and then we can forget it. Okay. But if we pay it attention, then we start working on it in our working memory. We handle it there. But then we can also easily forget that if we don't do much with it. We just sort of think about it for a while and then we just let it go. But if we work on it and we look at rehearsing it, retrieving it, then that helps to embed it in our long-term memory. And so working with it and recall can help to embed that. And that then stores it in long-term memory. And then it's still possible to forget, but it takes longer to do so. And we can keep practicing, keep recalling to help really embed it. So the EEF booklet suggests, learning then requires information to be committed to the long-term memory. And it's processed through our working memory. But we need to remember that our working memory has got limited capacity and can be overloaded. We need to think about how we structure learning in order to do that. So you can probably see the basis of Ofsted's interest in retrieval and recall and interleaving. It's about repetition. It's about enabling knowledge and understanding to become firmly connected in neural pathways in the brain. Again, many of you I know will know about Rosenshine's principles of instruction, and you'll recognize the connections there with brain plasticity, the idea of sequencing to make sure that the content that you're teaching builds up logically, the idea of questioning to make sure that information pupils are storing in their brains is correct, the idea of repetition and review, of retrieval and recall. You can see the link with brain plasticity, the need to make strong connections. Okay, one of the things we need to think about, though, is that while Rosenshine's principles, I think, are really good, it's very hard for us in RE when we may have about an hour a week. And much of the study and much of the research is done in maths and science and English. And of course, they have much more time than we do. It also sort of presupposes a kind of vertical ascent model of development and complexity in a subject, that you need this skill in order to move on to that one, and then you need that one to get to this one. So you need these foundations that you can't move on without having them. And so you can see how that applies in maths, for example. This vertical hierarchical, the order matters. You need to start with number and before you can move on, for example. But RE doesn't really work like that, does it? We've got this kind of horizontal growth in complexity, where we learn something and we can expand it and amplify it and build on earlier knowledge. So in one sense, the order isn't important where we start. We can start with something simple and we can get more complex sort of from whatever starting point we have. So that's worth bearing in mind, that some of the studies that are done look as if they're very strong, but they work in a different way to how the subject works. So we need to think about that, about how we're actually going to apply it in our subject. I think they're really important things we can apply, but it doesn't always work in the way it might work in English and maths. So if we're thinking about how we can help pupils to remember, a clear need for us is to make sure that pupils, we look here at strategies for remembering, a clear need is for pupils to encounter stuff more than once. So the idea that you've done a lesson, I've done that, tick, I've covered that. But obviously, we know that that's just not going to work, is it? And so as you do with all your other subjects that you're teaching, you need to go back and you need to cover things more than once. So encounter things more than once. So ideally, allowing space in our long-term plans for revisiting things again and again. So offering them opportunities to draw on material they've learned earlier in the term or in the year, or even in previous years. So a simple example might be that you do, for example, in RE, Christianity in term 1, Islam in term 2, and then a thematic question in term 3, which explores Christianity and Islam and non-religious worldviews, for example, which then allows them to recall some of the things they've done in previous terms. Just structuring a long-term plan in order to facilitate that might be helpful. Regular revision and retrieval of material learned is also important. And one of the major crazes to sweep the educational landscape in the last 10 years or so is quizzing, with lots of opportunities to recall past content. And some of the apps I know that you'll know about, Quizlet and Flickrs, they offer free apps that you might use that can be useful in this. And I'm sure that in your context, you can recommend more quizzing sort of apps. So quizzing and helping, just low stakes testing, just helping people sort of have to recall and retrieve stuff that you've taught them before, can help to embed it in their long-term memory. So research suggests that, that learning content, coming back to it after a time to forget it, requires the brain to work most effectively at retrieving the content. So it'll give them a little bit of time to forget, and then they have to work a bit harder, and that helps to build stronger connections. But I mean, I think, to be honest, that pupils can get pretty bored with all those tedious quizzes they have all over the place. So we might think about other ways of encouraging recall as well. So hexagons allow pupils to make multiple connections. And here they're about questions of belonging and community. So hexagons obviously can allow multiple different connections between other terms, other ideas, and they can use that to, there's no single right answer, for example, so it's a bit more flexible, and they're able to recall their past learning as they do it. Other strategies you might label diagrams or photos. You might give them a series of statements, a series of images. They have to put them into an order that makes sense to them, obviously depending on what you've been teaching them. It may be that you give them a set of images, a set of terms. They've got to suggest what is missing from there. Obviously, these are all ways of, these are different forms of quizzes, really, aren't they? Another might be the target board activity, thinking, what matters most? This is in the handout as well. We give them a target board, set of cards, put the cards face down, turn them over one at a time, and decide how important are these, in this case, what matters most to Muslims. And they're allowed 1 card in the very center, they're allowed 3 in the next circle, 5 in the next circle, 7 in the next. So what matters most of all, through to what matters, and then to what doesn't matter much can go outside the circle. And so here again, it's open-ended. It's recalling some of the language they've been learning in the unit you've just been doing with them. And they've got to think, they've got to come to conclusions, they've got to make a judgment. So they've got to have some reasons for doing this. There isn't a single right answer again. And so they're rehearsing and recalling and retrieving their past learning. You can see that that obviously is the sort of thing you need to do at the end of a unit, but it is also the sort of thing you come back to later in the term or a later term, because it's quite simple. It only takes 10, 15 minutes, and it's a good recall activity as well. Okay, so an opportunity really to just pause. And if you're watching this with colleagues, you might have a discussion about this, but to think about whether you find that that description of brain plasticity actually makes sense to how you learn and how you experience learning as well. And how might it make a difference to how you teach in terms of helping people to remember things? I mean, I know it, as teachers, you'll have been helping them to remember things for all your teaching career. But does the brain plasticity help sort of set that into a context of what is actually going on in your pupils' brains and your brains as well? And then what other ways do you use to help them to remember? What other things do you do to get them to be able to recall stuff that you've taught them? Okay, we'll just pause for a moment and you can discuss that. Okay, so we've looked at brain plasticity. This is sort of cognitive neuroscience, with brain scanning, that sort of thing. And we looked at a few examples, basic examples of strategies for remembering. We're going to move on to the idea of executive function, the idea of cognitive load. And then we'll think about how we might make sense of that in the classroom as well. Now, I want you to watch a short video clip. You'll need to scan the QR code or click on the link to do this. I can't show it to you because we don't have the copyright for that, but I encourage you to take it, it'll take about 1.5 minutes to do this. So I really encourage you to do this. And it's a sort of test really on you. And the question I always ask is how many times does a girl in a white t-shirt bounce the ball? But actually the guys in the video who made the video originally might ask you a slightly different question. So I would go with them. Okay, if you scan that QR code and watch that now, that would be great. Okay, well, I hope you've done that, and it may well be that you've seen this before. And I wonder how many of you did see the gorilla. When I first watched this with that group, those neuroscientists and the AS teachers, I did not see the gorilla. I could not believe it. I just couldn't believe it. And then when we watched it again, it's like, how could I possibly have missed that? Now, of course, if you've known about it, then you're aware, but you know, some of you may well remember not being able to see it. Now, this helps to introduce the idea of attention that we have. So there are 2 kinds of attention that we have. The first we might describe as sort of bottom up. We hear a loud noise at the window, we turn our heads, and our brain is processing that sensory data all the time. And so sensory novelty or intensity grabs our attention. It's an involuntary response, and we all have it, but it predominates in children. Now, the other kind of attention is top down. It's based in the frontal lobes of the brain, often seen as part of what's known as the executive function of the brain, and it involves the selection of relevant stimulus, and it directs our attention in a voluntary way. We choose where to focus. So this executive function develops our ability to direct and to select on the basis of what it is most meaningful, what is most relevant based on our experience. We select, in this case, the girl in the white t-shirt or the team in white, and we ignore the gorilla. Now, children are more likely to see the gorilla because they are less good at focusing their attention. Now, we talked about the structure of the brain a little while ago, and about the relative size of the cortex. You know, there's folded bits around the brain. The relative size between humans and other animals. It's the frontal cortex, which is the key to understanding the dominance of humans on our planet. As you can see, in a cat, only 3.5% of the brain is taken up with the frontal cortex. And if you watch a cat, it's at the mercy of external stimuli. You know, every sound, every movement, its head turns towards it, its ears twitching. And we also have that instinctive form of attention. So if someone bangs on the door at the back of your room, you know, you're likely to look around. And we need that ability because we need to be able to react instantly without thinking to external events, in case the movement is a man-eating tiger or a mad driver. So in humans, though, we have a much larger frontal cortex, and you can see there on the slide. It's the frontal lobes that have freed us, if you like, from having to respond to every stimulus and have enabled us to plan and to visualize and to control our responses to our environment. We can choose not to pay attention to certain external distractions. And so that ability, the so-called executive function, develops as we grow. So young babies are not much different to a cat. They respond to any distracting noise. And our pupils are beginning to get to grips with paying attention. But obviously our executive function is much more advanced than theirs. Now, this is what's going on in our classrooms every day, the battle between direction and distraction, between our executive function and the more instinctive parts of our brain. So one definition of executive function is that the ability to control thoughts and actions in order to respond flexibly to changes in the environment. So it's useful, particularly in novel situations where we have to draw on a range of resources in our brains to face a new challenge. And so the frontal lobes coordinate these resources in our response. And is involved then in decision-making, in planning, in shifting our attention from one stimulus to another. So you're sitting there preparing your lessons and the phone rings, and then you have to shift it back again. It's also involved in maintaining attention as distractions go on around you. It's important in terms of working memory, so holding relevant material in mind and manipulating it. And it's important in inhibition as well, both in inhibiting your own responses. Oh, I'm really hungry, I could really do with a snack now. So your own responses, but also resisting interference. So, you know, children coming up to your door, it's just like, no, I must concentrate. So inhibiting both of those. So here's an example from shopping. While we shop, we're doing all these things. You know, we've got to trying to remember our shopping list because we've got to write it all down. That's holding in working memory. We've got a couple of lists, actually. There's one for you and one for your mum. Now you've got to shift between your list and theirs as you go around the route. You've got to plan your route around the supermarket. So which aisles do you need to go down? Which aisles do you not need to go down? So you've got to plan that. You've got a toddler in the trolley as well. You've got to ignore their demands for chocolates. You've got to inhibit their interference. But you've also got to stop yourself from being tempted by the chocolate bar, inhibiting your own responses. And then you've got to make all these decisions as well. Should I buy this? Should I buy that? One's more expensive than the other. There's a moral demand to, you know, buy organic chicken, but can I afford to do this? So that's what's going on. Just you know, simple activity, if you like going shopping. So imagine what's going on in the classroom as well. The children, I mean, these are some year 8s, but it applies to primary children as well. You've got to remember what you're supposed to be doing. You've just been set a task, so you're holding something in your working memory. And then you've got to switch between the task and the teacher. The teacher gives instructions and then interrupts again with more instructions, so you're switching. You've got to do some planning. How am I going to do that? How am I going to respond to this? You've got to inhibit interference from your classmates who want to try and distract you. You want to inhibit your own responses, your natural tendency to daydream. No, I must concentrate, must focus. And then you've also got to make that decision. Well, should I finish it now? Should I do it now, or should I leave it because the teacher will get us to finish off the homework? Now you can see what it's like, but our frontal lobes, the executive function, are carrying out a hugely complex set of processes all the time. Now, the language that's used to describe executive function may give a false impression, as if we're somehow able to control what goes in our brain and our bodies to a much greater extent than is actually the case. Executive function is so called because the frontal lobes, front part of the brain, direct operations, as a chief executive might in a business. Or maybe as an orchestral conductor, is marshalling the resources of the orchestra to play together, managing their sort of integrated use. Others suggest that it's like a bouncer. It sort of controls our thoughts and responses, makes our brain do the things that we want it to do. But perhaps all these analogies give the executive function just a little bit too much control. We are trying to focus. So many other things intrude and make it difficult. Now, one writer, Jonathan Haidt, suggests it's more like a rider on an elephant. So the rider is our executive function, has some control over the elephant, but at any point the elephant can go its own way. Now, the reason why the elephant in this analogy has so much more influence than the rider is that the frontal lobes are so new in evolutionary terms. Now, they very often give way to the more developed, faster systems in the brain. And you can see the change here. Look at how it is the frontal lobes that have developed most recently, judging by the slope of the forehead. And so the frontal lobes are the most advanced parts of our brain in evolutionary terms. They're the most interconnected parts. They've got the most dense connections throughout the rest of the brain. But given their fast expansion, they're also the least perfected through evolution. So the older parts of the brain, such as our sensory or our motor parts, are very refined because they've been through so many more adaptations. We can construct computers that can beat us at chess, that can compute billions of pieces of information per second. But we can't construct a robot that can run through the woods as well as a 3-year-old. And that's because our motor systems have had millions more chances to adapt. That's fascinating, well, I think anyway. And it connects with current interests from Ofsted and other curriculum planners, that, which is the idea of cognitive load, the idea that our working memory can manipulate a limited amount of information at any one time. We can easily get overwhelmed. And so when that happens, nothing really gets laid down in long-term memory. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. And there's a really good paper on that. So again, you can scan that QR code. But I just want to give you another opportunity to pause and reflect and discuss, perhaps if you're working with others, about what we've just been talking about. So recognizing what is going on in children's brains, and ours as well, but the children you've got in front of you in your classroom, what difference does that make to how we approach teaching and learning? What practical steps can we take to help pupils? I'm going to give you a few moments to pause. You might like to pause the tape and then come back when you've had a chance to talk. Okay, I hope you've been able to think of some things that you might do. And one of the things that struck me when I reflected on my own teaching was, one thing that would make things much easier was that when I gave pupils instructions and set them off working, I then did not interrupt and give them more instructions. You think about the idea of just, they've got to try and handle this stuff and they're just beginning to handle it, and then teacher interrupts again with some new stuff. It's like, oh no, just lost what I had before. So just that's a simple suggestion about being really clear about the instructions before we then let pupils go off and do the stuff, and then we let them go off and do it. Another possible thing is to do with meditation and stilling. Those practices can help to train pupils to focus their attention, and people who've practiced meditating over a long period of time show that they're better able to focus attention. I mean, not surprisingly, because that's what their focus has been. But the mechanism that allows them to do this is that their brains are able to use fewer resources to attend to external stimuli. And so they're more able to manage the tasks at hand. And so, you know, whether training pupils to become better meditators might help them to shift, to manage the sort of shifting and the inhibiting elements of executive function better. maybe you might start lessons with a short meditative activity. I mean, there's a lot of information on mindandlife.org. Again, a lot of stuff about meditation and training. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that might play a role in your class. That was one of the bits of research I was going to do actually before I left the classroom to join RE today, to trial that with my classes. But let's move on now. We've done these three things. We've looked at the brain plasticity, and then the idea that our brains change, and as we practice, we recall things, we make stronger and faster connections in the networks of our brain, between the brain cells. And then we looked at a few simple strategies for remembering. Then we looked at the idea of executive function, which is trying to direct operations in our brain, and the notion of cognitive load, that actually we can overload our working memory and make it very hard for our executive function to function, really. And now I just want to think about this idea of how we help pupils to make better connections, the idea of deepening learning. So an influential paper from 2006 from Paul Kirshner, again, another educational psychologist in this case, who's very influential in this field. Now, his point is that if pupils don't have sufficient knowledge in their long-term memory, then they find it very hard to learn new stuff. And so he emphasizes that idea of working memory, the part of executive function, the idea that we can only hold a certain amount of information at any one time, so actively in the forefront of our minds, as it were, that we can then manipulate and apply. And so if we give open-ended and problem-based activities to pupils, actually, that depends really on us having quite a lot of knowledge to hand, knowledge stored in our long-term memory with fast connections, well-worn paths, so that we can retrieve it easily. So we've got a problem, retrieve it easily, and we can apply it to the problem. Now, if we don't have that knowledge in our long-term memory, then we spend all our time juggling new information and trying to apply it to the new tasks. And so Kirshner says that this leaves all the work done in the frontal lobes, but no new information laid down in the long-term memory. So his argument is that trying to give problem-based learning is bad for pupils. Now, it's okay when you're expert and knowledgeable, but it doesn't work in terms of establishing and embedding a pupil's knowledge. So Kirshner says instead that we should structure teaching, we should set it up so that we give the core information, we begin to show the wider connections to students in our lessons. We should not rely on them to make the connections. He also emphasizes the importance of identifying misunderstandings and mistakes early. Bearing in mind that idea of brain plasticity, if we make mistakes, that will also lay down neural pathways in our brain. So we don't want to keep practicing those mistakes, because then it makes it much harder to move on to getting it right. So I think you can see perhaps some of the links with Rosenshine's principles about repetition, retrieval, and recall, about structuring and sequencing learning. All these things are really important. But do remember what the Education Endowment Foundation research says. It can be easy to misapply learning that you can study in the laboratory with brain scans and under sort of lab conditions. So it can be easy to misapply. So we need to think about that. Also, this research is done in maths, which has that, do you remember, that vertical hierarchical knowledge structure, where you need the basics as a foundation before you can build further, as opposed to the kind of horizontal learning that we do in RE, where we can start somewhere and we can then add complexity and nuance to it. So how do we apply it to RE? I think Dan Williams' book is really helpful with this. And he talks about the difference between rote learning, simple memorization is repetition, repetition, repetition. He says there are a limited range of occasions when this is valuable, but it can be valuable. And sometimes you might say that times tables in maths might be a useful thing, although I've heard mathematicians suggest that rote learning of times tables isn't very good for maths. But anyway, that's not my area of expertise by any means, so I won't wade into that debate. But William says sometimes you can just repeat, and just memorize it. But then he talks about the difference between shallow learning and deep learning. So shallow is not a pejorative term there. He says that's the kind of surface facts that we need to know about a topic. They need to be set down in our long-term memory through a range of activities. sometimes memorization perhaps, where it's appropriate, and by going over it several times and encountering things in different contexts. And he says these are the building blocks of learning. Deep learning is when we begin to make the links between the different ideas that we build with those bits and pieces of shallow learning. We begin to see the patterns, we begin to make the connection, we begin to see the bigger picture. And that's where pupils move from just recalling information to being able to make sense of it. And that connects in Williams' terms with the idea of the language of the novice and the expert. As we learn new things, we build these sort of networks, schemata, they're sometimes called, these knowledge networks that are stored in our long-term memory. And so what we need to do is try and combine those two kinds of learning. The structured learning that lays down information in the long-term memory then sets up the possibility of addressing challenging open-ended tasks. So our executive function can retrieve information and can apply it to the novel situation and reveal our deeper understanding. So RE needs both of these approaches. One of the other key points that William makes is that whatever people think about, that's what they'll remember. So we need to, I mean, it seems absolutely obvious, doesn't it? But his example in the book is of a teacher who wants children to remember, to think about the plot line of a story, to get them to do a storyboard. Unfortunately, the story includes a castle. So for the next 20 minutes, the children spend all their time thinking about castles. You know, what's the ideal castle? You know, pointy towers, crenellations, a moat, drawbridge. So instead of thinking about the plot structure, they ended up thinking about castles. So it seemed like a really good activity, but actually they were thinking about something else. So whatever people think about, that's what they'll remember. So our tasks need to help pupils to be thinking about what it is that we want them to think about. And that's just really important. It's simple, but it's really important in terms of our task setting. So I just want to give you a couple of examples, which I hope will make people think about what we want them to think about, but also ways that enable them to encounter ideas and build the building blocks of learning and then add complexity as they lay this down in their long-term memory. So in your handout, you've got this set of cards. So again, you cut it up and give the cards, a pile of cards to pupils, and they're going to turn them over one at a time. And what you're going to do is you'll set this mystery strategy for them. And the mystery is, will Amir go on Hajj next year? Now, you may well already have introduced children to some of the key beliefs of Islam and Muslims. You may have actually mentioned, maybe even shown a short video of Hajj. Sometimes I would do this by showing a video of Hajj with the sound turned down, and they're looking and asking questions, writing questions down maybe. And then you have a go at this. So you turn the cards over one at a time, and they're using the information, little bits of information, to help them decide the answer to that question. They've got all the information in front of them, so they're not having to try and remember it all, but so they can move it around. Does this bit help them to understand? Is it relevant to him making a decision, to Amir making a decision? Some of it is just background knowledge, but it's very short bits of background knowledge. Okay, so they do this, they come to a decision, and you discuss their decision. Why do they think that? And they say, okay, you've got some questions from the short video we watched. Now, could you answer any of those questions? Because they've just looked at a whole load of information in these short bite-sized pieces in the cards. Then you might get them to watch the video again with the sound turned up, and then go back, okay, does that help you answer the questions? And then maybe you get them to write short narration for a part of the video as well. So that's another opportunity to encounter this content. So you're building this up a little bit at a time. That's just one lesson. Obviously, you come back to it again and look at some images from Hajj later on, say, well, what's going on here? And get them to maybe put them in order. So you're building this up. So you're building up in short pieces and connecting that. Remember, this is not hierarchical, we're not vertical. What we're doing is adding complexity and nuance in the horizontal progression, if you like. So have a look at that. Try that out with your children, or something similar to that. Now, a second suggestion, Dan William talks about how we understand things in the context of what we already know. I just want to give an example from my own experience. I went to part of my work at RE today, I went to a conference on critical realism. Now, I thought I knew a little bit about critical realism because I'd read some books by some RE people like Andrew Wright, who've written about this in terms of RE pedagogy. And I was going, in one sense, I was representing the rest of the RE Today team, and so I was writing some notes so that I could feed back to them so they could benefit from my experience as well. And we were there watching Roy Bashka, who's a guru in terms of critical realism. He died a few years ago now, but he was talking. He did a 90-minute session, and I was writing my notes. So here is the write-up of some of my notes. So basic critical realism involves actualism plus material transactions in nature and a stratification of the embodied personality. Dialectical critical realism has 4 meld levels. Now, it took me a while to work out what MELD was, but you can see it's an acronym there for moment, edge, level, and dimension. And so moment, non-identity, we think ontology is structured and differentiated. Edge is absence, we think the world is processual, offers a critique of mythological monovalence. 3 is level, that's totality, we think being is interrelated. And 4, dimension, transformative praxis. And then towards the end of the session, he gave this sort of final peroration. We face a crisis on all 4 planes of social being. We need to replace God with the cosmic envelope. We need to see spirituality as the presupposition of all life. We need to use empathy as the basis of all hermeneutic. We need to do unto others as your higher self would be done by. Now, on the way out of that session, I mean, there were Q&A and everything. On the way out, someone was walking next to me and they said, "Oh, what do you make of that?" And I remember saying to him, "None the wiser." Now, you know, I mean, I'm not stupid. I understand words. I could record the words. I could recognize the words he was using, but I was none the wiser as to what it meant. Now, by the end of the weekend, I was beginning to piece things together, and I was beginning to learn. I recognized this is somewhere where I was unconsciously incompetent at the start. I was consciously incompetent by the end, and recognized I just didn't know this. But it made me think about the lessons that I'd had where children would have been in my class and they would have known the words I was using, but they'd have been none the wiser about what it meant. So that idea, we understand things in the context of what we already understand. And so I went into that with very little understanding. And so it was just so difficult to get hold of. And so the idea that we need to set a context for children into which their learning can sit. And so, for an example, some of you may have encountered our Understanding Christianity resource. And in that, we've tried to put pupils' learning into a wider context by introducing them to one Christian way of understanding the big story of the Bible, which is to suggest that these sort of 8 core concepts tell a story, that some Christians see the Bible as being not just a separate series of books created by humans, but somehow telling the story of a relationship of God and humanity. So a sort of overarching story. Obviously, there are disagreements and nuance in that as well, but that idea, if pupils have an idea that there's this story, this general story behind it, then it helps them to put things into place when they encounter it as they study it. So there's one suggestion there of how we help pupils to put things into context so that we can then make sense of it and begin to see those connections for that deeper learning. Another strategy is what I'm calling sketch a text. And so I'm going to have a go at doing this with you now. Of course, if you don't want to do this, you can whiz through. But I'd suggest you do just get a piece of plain A4 paper. I'm going to tell you a short story in 8 scenes. So you might like to just divide your paper into 8. And then I'm going to tell you part of the story, and if you can draw it. Now, no one's marking your drawings. Stick people, just scribble. It's absolutely fine. You're just going to try and record the story. I'm not going to give you very long between each description. Obviously, you could pause it and give yourself a little bit longer, but you don't have to do that. So a short story in 8 scenes. So you get a piece of paper and divide it into 8. And here's scene 1. A man is on a journey and comes to a dense forest. The forest is full of carnivorous beasts, ravenous lions, tigers, and elephants, more terrible even than death. The man is deeply disturbed and his hair stands on end. In terror, He runs about looking for shelter, trying to escape from the beasts. Scene 2. As he runs, he realizes that the forest is wrapped up in a huge net, and the net is embraced in the arms of a monstrous woman. There is no escape. Scene 3. We're zooming back into the forest again. Suddenly, as he runs, the floor of the forest gives way and he plunges through some creepers into a concealed well. Scene 4. His feet become tangled up in the creepers and he is suspended upside down like an enormous fruit. Scene 5. Looking down, he sees that a powerful snake is waiting at the bottom of the well. Scene 6. Looking upwards, he sees that a great elephant is slowly circling the edge of the well, an elephant with 6 blackened mouths and 12 feet. Scene 7. It's quite a long scene. As he looks, he notices some fearsome bees coming from a tree overhanging the well. In the midst of the tree, he sees a stream of honey flowing down towards him. He reaches out to drink it, his thirst for its sweetness overwhelming his fears. With each mouthful, he is left unsatisfied and needs more. In scene 8, the final scene, out of the corner of his eye, he notices some black and white mice nibbling on the creepers. There's a little coda, which you don't need to draw. It goes like this. Despite the great and terrible dangers he is in, the man does not get tired of living or give up hope of life. And there he stays, thrown into the ocean of existence. Okay, so you've drawn the pictures. What I want you to do next is to talk to someone else and spend just a couple of minutes going through the story together. So help each other to retell that story. So you might have to pause this while you do that. So you retell the story to each other, and so you're going through it once. Then you'll see part of the handout has got a page which looks like this, and it says what you think each part of the story represents. So in the next part of the story, the guy who tells the story says that each of these parts of the story represents something about life, about being thrown into the ocean of existence. So I want you in pairs or your groups to go through the different parts of the story. You don't have to take ages on this. You don't have to start at the top and work your way through all of them, but just say, I don't know, who you think, what they think the sweet honey might represent, or the concealed well. If this is about life, what do the different parts of the story represent? So you have a go at that. You might like to pause it again. And then let me explain then. You've had a go at thinking about what the different things represent. And so when I've done this with pupils and with teachers, actually, I've had a few interesting things. So I remember a year 6 pupil talking about the honey being like an iPhone. So it's a sweet honey. So you really desired this iPhone. It was really great. You reached out for it and you got one, and then it wasn't satisfying because within 6 months they bought out a new one. So it wasn't the best. The idea of sweet honey that doesn't give, doesn't quench your thirst. Anyway, in the next chapter, Vidura tells the next part, he says, the dense forest represents the human condition as a whole, that the carnivorous beasts represent the diseases, and the monstrous woman represents old age that destroys color and form, is how he puts it. It says that the concealed well is our physical human body, And the tangle of creepers that hold him up from plummeting to the bottom of the well is the hope of life. Powerful snake at the bottom of the well is death. And the great elephant represents the years in a tropical climate. And so there are 12 months, but 6 seasons, six mouths, 12 feet. The fearsome bees represent human desires. Sweet honey, the trivial pleasures that don't satisfy. And then the black and white mice are nights and days nibbling away at the creepers towards our inevitable demise. Now, there you've had the strategy, you've listened to the story, you had to sketch it, so you had to process it once. You then retold the story to each other, and so you processed it again. Then you had to think about interpreting the different sections of the story, so you processed it again. And then you listened to Vidora's answers, and so you processed it again. So one short lesson, 20 minutes, half an hour maybe, you've been through that story 4 times. And so that idea of repetition. So it's simple, it's engaging. And then if you started the next, let's say, how many of you can remember the story of the man in the well? Can you tell it to each other, to your partner? You can use your sketch if you need to, but actually you might remember. And my experience of doing this with children and with teachers, that actually between you and the pair or the small group, you remember quite a lot of the actual words that were told in the story. And the story, I've included the story in your handout as well, so you can use that. So that's a really important strategy in terms of a simple and engaging way of helping people to encounter things more than once, to build things into their long-term memory, embed it in their long-term memory. So not overwhelming them, because they're not having to juggle these ideas in their head because they're drawing it. And then they can refer to that. So they're able to then process some of that information, because they're encountering a lot of times their repetition and the recall is helping them. Actually, there's a real valuable thing in terms of helping set a context for pupils' learning as well. Remember, Dan Williams says we understand things in the context of what we already know. And so this is helping pupils in their beginning study of Dharmic religious traditions. So it's actually a Hindu story from Mahabharata, and it sets up this idea that actually in Dharmic traditions, there isn't a linear view of time. So in Abrahamic traditions, in Western thought, often the idea is, we're born and we live and we die. And for some people, there's sort of continuation after we die. But in Dharmic traditions, actually, the idea is that there's cyclic. There's a cycle that our self is born into a physical body. Some would say trapped in a physical body, and it lives in this world. And what it needs to do, it gets seduced by the illusion that is around us. It makes us think, like honey, it's really, really important. We really want this. But actually, that blinds us to the perils that we're in. And so actually, as human beings, we have a chance to make some moral choices, to wake up, to understand the situation we're in, and to find some way out of it. And that's why it's so important in Dharmic traditions to wake up, to be awakened or enlightened sometimes, or to have reached the goal where you might then return to Brahman, for example, in Hindu Dharma. Your individual self might then merge back with Brahman. And so this idea that if you understand that story, the idea that human beings, we think the physical world is really important, but actually it's not. If we understood the situation we're in, we would desire to be away from it. And also how within the Hindu tradition, there are so many different pathways as well. There are lots of different ways of waking up and recognizing the truth. And there are lots of different pathways out as well. There is not just a single set of truths about this. So that helps set a context for pupils learning about Hindu Dharma, about Buddhism, Buddha Dharma, maybe about Sikhi, about Sikh teachings and Sikh practice. And so we've got this strategy that helps people to remember things. And then we've got a text that helps set the context so they can begin to make those wider connections as well. The mystery strategy, the sketch of text, they combine enjoyment and engagement with the reinforcement of building blocks of knowledge that we want them to remember. And it deals with cognitive load challenges. So the content is introduced in chunks, and there are lots of opportunities to embed and recall their learning. Okay, so we've looked at these 4 areas, and I've tried to set out the kind of theoretical background for some of the current practices, retrieval and chunking and interleaving, and also to suggest some general ideas for how you might apply them. I've just got a few more things that I think are helpful. Some of you may remember Howard Gardner, the guy who talked about multiple intelligences a decade or so ago. In one sense, his work has been slightly discredited on that, but a book that he's contributed to on executive function in education, he makes what I think is a really helpful little description about hill, skill, and will. He says that when we're teaching, we've got to set the hill. We've got to think of the clear goal we want pupils to achieve, whatever that is, a skill or some knowledge or whatever. And then we've got to enable them to attain that goal, to go up that hill. So the hill shouldn't be too steep, shouldn't be too shallow, it should just be the right sort of pitch. We've got to then give them the ability to get up there. But he also says we need to be thinking about the will as well. We need to be thinking about what we can do to enable pupils to want to go up that hill and to keep going until they get to the top of the hill. And I think that that's one of the things that sometimes stuff about teaching and learning neglects, that actually for us as teachers, motivation and engagement for pupils to get them to want to do what we're asking them to do it's just really important. And so hill, skill, and will, all 3 elements are important in our lessons. If we're just doing hill and skill, but pupils are just not bothered, not interested, it's an uphill battle, I suppose. It's supposed to be. Anyway, you know what I mean. Hill, skill, and will. I think that's quite a helpful thing. Second thing is that the Education Endowment Foundation, they talk about the real challenge of applying cognitive neuroscience to the classroom. So they point out that there's loads of evidence about from laboratories about the memory in the brain. There's lots of research, lots of studies that's done. But the evidence for applying it into the classroom is much more limited, right? Because the classroom is so much messier than the lab, where you're trying to focus on one particular thing and testing that again and again. So the classroom is messy, it's very complex. So there are a few studies that support some of those practices, like retrieval, like spaced learning, some of those. But the retrieval practice particularly is mainly done in maths. And I mentioned already this idea that's sort of vertical progression as opposed to horizontal progression. I don't want to overstate those, but just that they are, we're looking at different subjects. They make the point again about dual coding. It's very possible to implement that poorly. You think you're helping pupils to connect an idea with an image, but actually it's just a distracting illustration. And so they warn us as educators to be careful in thinking that just because we know a little bit of stuff about cognitive neuroscience or cognitive psychology, we can just apply it, it'll just work. Remember what I said earlier, some of the research suggests actually it's teacher enthusiasm that really makes the difference, rather than some of the material, some of the approaches that are being used. They are really reminding us to avoid lethal mutations, those sort of neuromyths, where we think, well, I've got that and this is how it works, and think actually it's often much more complex than that. And then also that relationship there is needed between the studies and then what goes on in wider pedagogical approaches. So, the idea of instruction versus inquiry. And we dealt a little bit with that in this session. So they're saying, be careful about that. And then in their book, they suggest here are some of the factors that are going to affect teaching and learning. It's not a simple thing. Well, I've just done a bit of retrieval and therefore people will remember it. It's so complex. I'm not going to go through this slide. You can pause it and have a look at it. You should get hold of that booklet and it will give you much better than I can. It'll give you a lot of key information there. So that's the Education Endowment Foundation. They're the experts. A third thing I just wanted to say is the importance of thinking about the impact of trauma on the brain. And so many of you will have children in care in your classes. Many of you will have children who are not in care, but maybe they've been through trauma. So maybe during COVID, some of their family were very ill. They may even have had a family member who died. And actually the impact of that on the physical structures of their brains, can have a real impact on their learning. So children then with what are psychologists call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Those traumas can affect brain development. And so if they feel, so if they're under threat at home from violence, if there's a heightened sense of risk or a sense of danger, then their brains get flooded with a hormone cortisol, a sort of stress response. And what that does is it makes them highly alert to the danger. And the amygdala, which is one of the sort of oldest parts of the brain, if you like, is a smoke detector for danger, and it's like, it then takes priority. So the frontal cortex, remember, which is executive function, which is selecting and directing and choosing what we want to do and planning and shifting and inhibiting interference. It's like, well, that just, that's just overwhelmed by this sort of fear response and, what's going on. Now that then means that you're thinking, what is being highly alert, highly stressed about what is going on now. Now, I mentioned the hippocampus area of the brain with those taxi drivers about visual spatial memory. It's got that part of the role, but it also is thinking about, it's alert to what's dangerous, and it also does the work of transferring what's been learned to long-term memory. Now, of course, if you're at high alert, if your emotional brain's taken over, it's really flooded the brain with cortisol, then that's what is overwhelming. And so you're not in a process of laying down long-term memories. And so actually, if under threat, children can't process what they've learned. So it may well be that they've been in your class, but something has made them just so anxious about something that they've been there, but they have not heard. They don't remember any of the things because actually the memories are not embedded in the brain. And so then you come back the next day, well, we talked about this yesterday. So it's like, there's no memory there. And so that idea of trauma and the brain is just something that is worth looking at and thinking about that, particularly if you know that you've got children who've been through various kinds of trauma. There's a lot of research on that. There's a lot of suggestions, a lot of things that you might look up. I mean, actually, one illustration about this, which I found horrifying, really, but it has real impact, is the Harvard still face experiment, which you can watch. You look at that; it's very short. The idea that with a baby, a mum talking to the baby and very animated and playing, and the baby just really responding, and then the mum turns her face away and comes back and keeps her face deadpan. And so, just for this experiment is just for a couple of minutes, but the video, you just see sort of slices of it for about 40 seconds. The impact that has, the distress that just having this still face, the distress that causes to that child, that infant, is just horrifying, really. And so if it can have that much impact for a couple of minutes of just not responding, you think about the impact of neglect over weeks or years or whatever in a child's life, or other things that might affect them. So it's just again, I don't want to make too many connections with this. I want to make more of this than there is, and certainly more than I know about this. But it just made me think about, we need to be really thinking about the impact that trauma might have on the brains of children that we've got in our classes, and think about how we might then respond to it. Okay, so we're going to finish in just a moment, and you might talk to your colleagues about what you've found out from this, and whether there are any particular things that you think, let's look into that a little bit more detail. Let's get a bit more expert opinion, expert view on this. I wonder whether there are things that you think will make a difference to your classroom practice. Like I say, one simple thing might be, you give instructions and then you let pupils get on with it. You don't keep interrupting. It may be that, yes, actually you really see that that's how that works in your maths teaching, and you need to think about how you're going to adapt that really for your RE, that you can't think that in maths you would never just say, well, I counted to 1 to 10 last week, I don't need to do that anymore. So then we mustn't do that in RE either. Well, we looked at these Muslim beliefs, we've done that once, so we'll just move on. Of course you wouldn't do that, so we need to think about it. So I wonder whether there's something that some way in which this makes you think, oh yeah, okay, that's why I do it like that. That is why I've always done it, because I can see that works. and that can connect with plasticity or executive function. So what impact does that have on what you have been doing? How does it help you understand what you've been doing, and maybe what impact might it have on what you do in the future? So you might pause the recording now and discuss that. I'm not going to pause. I've given you a handout which includes some background information and some of the links. But remember, the Education Endowment Foundation, I think they give you perhaps more up-to-date links than some of mine. Get in touch if you haven't. If you see any great work from your pupils as a result of any of the things that I've talked about, please do let me know. Always good to see pupils' work. But I hope that's been useful. I'm not an expert in this. Remember, I'm not trying to set up any neuromyths. I'm trying to give you a background, basic sort of contextual setup so that you can take this a little bit further. I hope it's been useful. Thanks very much.